Brilliant. Shall I do my fancy antitrust policy notice to get us started?
Please do.
All right. So, with this meeting, as with all of the OpenChain meetings, we conducted under the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. You can find the full policy on the Linux Foundation website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. This meeting, as a side note, is being recorded and will be shared widely on our website later. So if you're not watching live, welcome to the recording, and don't worry, you can ask questions and interact via our mailing lists and other channels. With that, Matthew, I turn back to you for your work as co-chair of the AI study group to explain what happened at the last meeting.
Thank you, Shane. I appreciate it. I know we've only got a few people on the call, but maybe this will be helpful for the recording. We have, or at the last meeting, we had 3 presentations. 2 of them were on ISO 4201, and then that was from Sandra from ARM, and then Dave and Jeff from Qualcomm. And then we had Max from Alibaba also talking about AI sort of thoughts and processes in building trust in the ecosystem. I will say that unfortunately none of those speakers are able to dial in today, so I'm going to do a very poor job, I'm sure, of going through what went through last time. If there are any questions, I can try and answer them, but we might need to reach out to the other folks. So we started talking about ISO 42001. This was a standard that had been mentioned at previous AI study group sessions. And so we wanted to do a deeper dive into what is this standard and how does it relate to ISO 5230, which is the OpenChain licensing standard. So this standard, it was published in 2023, and it is a standard of establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improving an AI management system. Organizations can elect to apply the requirements based on this ISO standard, and it's a risk-based approach, so it doesn't go into lots of details of how one would implement this, but it's thoughts around certain categories. It's got 2 annexes, which we'll go into in more detail shortly. Annex A provides a non-exclusive list of controls that can be adopted by an organization through the AI lifecycle. And Annex B provides guidance towards implementing those controls. So this ISO standard also requires the organization to document, audit its AI management systems periodically, as most ISO standards do in relation to other areas of work. The ISO standard 42001 has several different working groups below it. So we've got working group 1, which is around foundational standards, working group 2 around data, working group 3 around trustworthiness, working group 4 around different use cases and applications. Working group 5 is around compute approaches and compute characteristics of AI systems. And then there's a joint working group 1, which is about the governance and implications of AI. We didn't go through any of the sort of more granular ISO standards below. This chart has kind of been brought together kind of as different areas that 4201 kind of covers, and a lot of these go up into this larger standard. So we also picked up, and I can't see it on my screen, no, it's right down at the bottom of working group 3. Bias in AI systems came up in our last working group session. What does bias mean? What does bias in AI systems mean? And we, started questioning what the what that means, how we can define it. Is it defined in a legal sense? Is it defined elsewhere? And we highlight here that there are other standards that have gone in to define certain keywords that we might want to reference, for example. the general consensus was that there is certainly some overlap with 4201 and 5230, but there's certainly areas where we can expand on. Any questions at this point? We did open it up very briefly to a discussion on this, but then we sidetracked and went straight into Jeff and Brian's slides. So again, rather than what we just presented, which was the very high level and the working groups underneath, we now go into those Appendix A and Appendix B for ISO 4201. And again, Jeff and Brian did a great job of facilitating this conversation. So what we did is we merely just went through all of the different points in the different sections of Annex A and Annex B and compared it with the OpenChain policy, the OpenChain specification, to see whether there was some overlap. This is a PDF version of the slides, so there were animations, as in this tick wasn't there in the first slide, and we kind of had a discussion of whether it did, and then the tick was kind of brought in afterwards when we all agreed that it probably was. So this slide in section 2 of Annex A relates to policies that an organization shall document a policy for the development of AI systems. The organization shall determine how the policy aligns with other policies, and an AI policy shall be reviewed at planned intervals. This, to Jeff and the other participants, thought this was kind of just boilerplate for ISO standards, and it's clearly directly correlating to the policy section 3.1.1 in ISO 5230. Any comments so far?
Just a quick note that this thinking seems to build directly on previous calls, so it's not a departure at all from previous workshops, as I understand it. So maybe people who've only attended, let's say, a meeting, let's say April, when they come back in June, they still should find it as a linear approach as opposed to any changes. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yeah, and I think we are building up towards creating a list of general principles where we can focus on how we build trust in the ecosystem for AI. How we define that title is up to discussion, but that's the end goal. And before we get there, we will have a scratch pad and a document where we can maybe take 5230 and we can maybe start adding and removing things based on what the community is wanting. And then before that, we're now at kind of this section here. We're comparing 5230 with what else is out there, because we don't want to duplicate anything. And if we go back to the April meetings, we looked at 5230 and we're starting to work out what we thought was relevant from that to an AI list of principles. Does that answer your question, Shane? It's certainly linear in my opinion, and I kind of went backwards there.
No, that's good. And we have that board meeting coming up June 26th. And I guess showing them this linear progress and giving them a taste of where this may be going will be useful, because then we can have board feedback in place for the July AI call, just to let them know what the board thinks of progress so far.
Yeah, and at the board meeting, we can give an update, Shane.
That is really great. Oh, by the way, Kieran from Open Forum Europe is just let me know that he plans to join the call in a few minutes. And that's interesting because he's an expert on the EU AI Act. So he has a background on the AI Act and where that's going. He just did a webinar on that for us, but having him live might be useful as well for our syncing up.
Great. Look forward to seeing Kieran. Moving on, again, carrying on with section 2, of the policies relating to AI. Annex B, again, just goes into a bit more detail of what could be done. So we're looking at it should be informed by business strategy, organizational values, risk tolerance, legal requirements, including contracts, impact to interested parties. Then there were a whole host of other things that Jeff highlighted, including sort of impacts to shareholders, amongst other things. And it goes on to say that the policy should include these three topics at the bottom, and we talked on this middle point a little bit more about handling deviations and exceptions to the policy. And we opened it up for discussion for those people who know 5230 a little bit more than others around whether 5230 has any deviations or how to handle deviations and exceptions from the policy. And I don't know if anyone here wants to kind of chip in on that. There certainly were other comments there about how do we manage escalations, or if something is just unthought about when defining a policy, how those are managed in terms of either a mitigation plan or who in an organization can sign things off. Let's carry on. Internal organization, so how the roles and responsibilities are assigned for AI. So whether that is the developers, they know what they're accountable for, top management, what they're accountable for, any lawyers in an organization, what they are accountable for in terms of maybe providing advice, a compliance group, an ethics group. These roles and responsibilities aren't defined in this Annex A, but should be thought about when we sort of implement something within an organization. And there seems to be quite a strong correlation with what we have in 5230 around section 3.2, which is relevant tasks and defining and supported. And we highlight there roles and responsibilities within an organization for open source license compliance in terms of what a developer does, what the lawyers are doing, maybe what an OSPO is responsible for within an organization. So again, we definitely saw correlations between section 3 of ISO 4201 and 5230. I'm going to move on unless there are any other comments, and we can just kind of go through the rest of the policies. So Annex B goes into more detail, again talking about we're going backwards. Roles and responsibilities, highlighting for AI, which should be defined and allocated according to the needs of the organization. So make sure something is well resourced. The organization should consider AI policies, AI objectives, identify risks when assigning roles and responsibilities in order to ensure that all relevant areas are covered. And again, we thought this was parallel to what we have in 5230. Section 4 covers the context of an organization. So organization shall determine relevant external, so regulatory, landscape, local norms, and internal issues like contract obligations, intended purpose for its AI management system. And organizations shall determine whether climate change is a relevant issue. And this climate change has come up several times throughout the AI study group. I've also heard it outside of OpenChain becoming more and more important on whether climate change, when we talk about AI, is relevant. Partly because, and I don't want to misquote, so I won't choose a number, but I've heard that the large language models, the energy required to run these is so much more than our everyday compute that it probably should be something we want to consider when taking one of these models or wanting to use one of these models. So they've highlighted that in there. I don't think there's any correlation to climate change in 5230, but there are certainly obligations for license compliance in 5230. So it's whether we want to change those wordings to mirror some of these contexts of the organization. Annex B, I keep on going back, I don't know why. So next, resources for AI systems. This is ensuring that there's enough resources for the organization to fully address the risks. So we've got resources to identify and document the resources required. As part of resource identification, the organization shall document information about the system and computing resources, tooling resources, data resources utilized for the AI system. And as part of that resource identification, organizations shall document information about the human resources and their competencies utilized for the development, deployment, operation, change management, maintenance, transfer and decommissioning. So it's the full life cycle that we ensure that a company can succeed, or they're certainly thinking about the resources when using and implementing AI systems. This has got a sort of slightly looser relationship to 5230 to make sure things are effectively resource, but we don't appear to address it explicitly in 5230. Moving on to section 5, we talk about leadership. So top management shall understand the AI policy, have objectives and established, and they're supported. They shall set the purpose and objectives, make sure it's documented, communicated. So they're kind of responsible for the implementation of the AI policy, and whether and top management isn't defined in 42001, but that could be the executive level or the executive level's leadership. But it's something that could be documented based on the individual organization, or defined based on the individual organization's need. 5230 doesn't include any concept of top management. Yes, we highlight roles and responsibilities, but this top management isn't considered. Next section, again, moving on, assessing the impacts of AI systems. So Annex A and B cover an objective to assess AI systems, how they impact individuals or groups of individuals or both, and societies affected by AI systems throughout the life cycle. The organization shall establish a process to assess the potential consequences for individuals throughout its life cycle. I've just read that. The organization shall document the results of AI systems and how they impact and retain results for a defined period. This, we thought, was slightly outside of the scope of what we had in 5230. We tried to loosely connect this with our bill of materials, but probably not quite accurate. So this might be something we would maybe consider if implementing 4201, or we need to see how it relates to the license compliance that we have in 5230. Section 6 talks about planning. So giving assurances that the AI system can achieve its intended results. We prevent, reduce undesired effects and continual improvements. Organizations shall define and establish AI risk assessment processes that are aligned with the policy and objectives. Assess the potential consequences to an organization, individuals and society. 2, the likelihood of the risk happening. And 3, the levels of the risks. And then prioritize a risk mitigation or treatment, mediation or treatment. AI objectives should be documented, consistent with the policy, be measured, account for requirements, monitored, communicated, updated as needed, and available as documented information. 5230, we talk about the contrast to an objective criteria for license compliance, but I don't think we go into talk about the details here of full planning life cycle. Section 6, management guidance for AI system development. So Annex A talks about the need to ensure that an organization identifies, documents, objectives, and implements processes for the responsible design and development of AI system. And we thought there was a direct relationship with 5230 with the awareness section. Management guidance for an AI development system. The Annex B goes into slightly more detail. So an organization shall identify and document objectives for responsible development of AI systems, processes for responsible design and development of AI systems, specify and document requirements for new AI systems, AI system design and development, verification and validation methods, the necessary elements for the ongoing operations of an AI system, technical documentation, and record keeping of event logs. So just going into more detail around the management guidance of AI system development. Jeff took over at this point in the last session to talk about the section 7 of the ISO standard 4201. We talked about support, or this section is around support. So in summary, we determine, provide resources needed to establish, implement, maintenance, improvement of AI management systems, determine, ensure, acquire competence related to performance, evaluation, awareness of the policy, management system, implications of non-conformance, communication both internal and external. And there seem to be a number of sections related to the OpenChain specification on this. So effectively resourced, there's providence for support if there's any issues. 3.1.2 is around competence, 3.1.3 is around awareness, 3.1.1 refers to how we can communicate between different organizations. Seven 7.5 talks about support and documented information. So in summary, we require documentation as required by the standard for the effective AI management system. Creation and updating considerations, control of documentation, including security considerations. Again, OpenChain specification talks about the need for policies to be documented and communicated to the organization. Section 8 talks about the operation. So in summary, we plan, implement, control process to meet the requirements as related to operation of AI management systems. Risk assessments are defined by section 6.1.2, which perform regularly and results documented. Risk treatment plans are defined by 6.1.3, including testing, updating, and documented. AI system impact assessments are defined by 6.1.4 and regularly and documented. Again, this correlates similar to our policy of 3.1.1 around having things well documented in the policy. Performance evaluation, this is seen as, I guess, a new thing compared with what we already have. So what is performance evaluation? What methods are we using? How are we monitoring, measuring, analyzing, evaluating? When we do internal audits, how are we planning, implementing, and maintaining these models? And the management review, the scope of the presentation. And this is certainly new compared with what we have in 5230. So improvement, continuous improvement to ensure we have suitability of the effectiveness AI management system, related actions where non-conformance is detected. This is a section that isn't covered in our specification. Getting towards the end now, there are some tables towards the end of 4201. So we talk about data for AI systems, defining, documenting, implementing processes related to the data management processes of AI systems, the acquisition of data, the quality of data, the data provenance, the data preparation. And we talk about information for interested parties, and I think this can be sort of summed up with AI bill of materials. How do we document things and give this to our partners? Technical details, what instructions are given here, or the ability to report back adverse effects. So this is covered in our policy around having something like a mitigation plan if something happens, how you contact the organization. Annex A9, use of AI systems, assurance that the organization uses according to the policy and is responsible. We define, document responsible use and objectives to guide responsible use, and we ensure use according to its intended use. So we're documenting using the right resources while monitoring and testing. And the final section is third-party and customer relationships, understanding obligations and accountability to third-party users, including risk apportionment, responsibilities for different parts of the AI lifecycle, and are allocated between organizations, partners, suppliers, customers, and third parties. Processes to ensure that usage of systems, products, materials via suppliers aligns with the requirements. And we ensure that the customer expectations are considered during the development of use. Something that is just about touched on in 3.1.1 in the OpenChain specification, but could probably go into more detail. And with that, I again give my apologies for maybe not being as knowledgeable as the previous presenters on this topic, but that was kind of a summary of where we got to with everything that's in ISO 4201 and compared it to the 5230.
It's really useful to have this bite-sized update, because the workshop itself is 2 hours and very interactive. So there's a lot of discussion, there's occasional tangents, and having this concentrated overview very much helps, especially I think for non-native speakers. One thing I wanted to ask, but before I do, I'll just make a note. Kieran's joined the line, so in a minute I'm going to ask Kieran a question as well. But one thing I wanted to ask was, it seems like in the AI study group, some commonalities, some shared concerns are being identified. Given that, do you think there's room for the AI study group to eventually lead towards some form of reference document or guide document explaining general concerns, general ways of managing AI compliance in the supply chain?
Is that directed to me or to the group?
This is the Matthew question. The next question, the Kieran question. My apologies.
We certainly think so. We did, we've highlighted a lot of overlaps here, but the 4201 is much higher level. We are more focused on open source license compliance. So there was definitely the room to create additional documented resources, which probably go more into the detail of have a good license compliance with these AI models. Data sets are verified and checked for license compliance. So yes is the answer. I don't think there is going to be scope to solve AI models, sorry, not AI management systems in general, because there are other ISO standards as shown in the first presentation. But in the area where OpenChain has sort of specialized in, yes, I think there is the need to. And this was a topic that we were going to discuss next time in further detail.
So in that case, a takeaway might be that in some ways we're finding that our predictable approach of a certain level of process inflection point identification on supply chain management might work for AI. And July onwards, we can probably expect discussions of tightening that up and seeing what could be an outcome, what could be some reference or guidance material. Would that be accurate?
That is correct, Wayne. Yep, Shay.
Brilliant. That's quite exciting. That's quite exciting to hear. And it'll be very interesting to bring, the fact that the 6 months of discussion has brought us to this point where we found some commonalities to bring that to the board. Now, for Kieran, you have just given a webinar for us on the EU AI Act. I think this might be one of your first times joining our AI study group. So as you can see, what we're dealing with here is talking about process management. And we're really talking about how entities or groups of entities in the supply chain are dealing with something like AI in the same way that they would deal with something like open source license compliance or open source security assurance. For context, when we do license compliance, OpenChain and our ISO standard for license compliance says we're focused on building a program. So inside one entity, that entity sets up a program for open source compliance. And that program will have people who are given responsibilities and trained, and the program will execute on certain process points. And the process points are in license compliance, check the software that's coming in, check what licenses it's under, and make a record of that. And internally, essentially track the software and keep records. And when distributing the software, check what it is, check what license it's under, what the terms are, document that. So fairly mundane stuff, but entity by entity, as they use that and they link up in the supply chain, a lot of the errors are pushed away. Anyway, the reason I was going through that context, and I know you already know a lot of this for OpenChain, but I'm also speaking to the recorded audience. The reason I was going through that for context is because we clearly focus on business operations and with the optic of creating a trusted supply chain. And we have an ISO standard for license compliance and an ISO standard for security assurance that work on a program scale, program by program, company by company. So you could say the corporate side of managing stuff. Now in AI, we're just bringing the conversation together, but the level, as you could understand from the call, the level is similar. We're talking about the corporate management of AI in the supply chain. Of course, that doesn't mean we want to ignore the policy and regulation side. And the EU AI Act appears to be a very significant, important, and how I put it, non-negotiable part of the future of AI. We're all going to have to work with this. With that in mind, Kieran, I just wanted to check with you if you've had any feedback from industry people, from companies, if you've heard of any feedback. How are companies responding to the EU AI Act? Are they responding to it positively? Does it seem like they'll be able to implement its requirements easily? Have companies flagged challenges or concerns that you're aware of? And this is an informal call, by the way. There's no need to give a great answer. This is, as usual with OpenChain, an area for spitballing and conversation.
I can't hear you, Kieran. I don't know if
I think your audio is not, yeah. I suspect he's got too many computers.
There we go. So you should hear me now. So I think what's happening is that there is not as much discussion as I would expect. And I can only speculate that it is because people are not sure how to apply the AI Act and how to define things like source code and whether their software will or not fit into the definition of free and open source software in the exemption of the AI Act, simply because there's not enough clarity on what does the definition apply to? Does it apply to the training data, or does it apply to the models or the weights or the algorithms within the models? So I think there is still a lot of work to be done to get people to understand what is happening on AI in general and how it's similar to software and how it's different. So for the moment, that's what I'm trying to work on. I'm not familiar at the moment with supply chain compliance, for example, but there are so many different areas that I think the more we can help get a general understanding, the more we'll get the cross-pollination that we need, so that the people who are expert in licensing are talking to the supply chain people, and they're talking to the technical people, and they're talking to the internal compliance people. And if we can get all these people to talk together, then we can just ensure that whatever policies are being put in place, that they're not being developed in a silo, which may sound practical to the person who is focused on implementing their requirements, but then when it gets sent to other departments, it may it may raise some eyebrows. And so what I think is the whole conversation would benefit from a more of an understanding. I've also noticed that often when topics on AI are raised, the discussion might start with one issue. It might start with, for example, the copyright status of training data, and very quickly the discussion moves to what happens when privacy is violated by the output of an AI system. And topics that should be very separate, they get merged. And I think that's also because people still need to separate in their minds the different issues that are caused by AI, and then also the different places where the fix has to be implemented. So you might have an issue of bias in the application layer, and that might have to be fixed in the training data. And people need to understand the separation of issues at the problem level, and then also the separation of issues at the solution level. So that might not be the answer to your question, but that's what I think is how we get to a solution of that. So I'm not going to bring a solution, but I hope that we will be able to help the ecosystem in general get to a solution. And with legislation already being written with the AI Act, and then other parts of the world also writing their legislation, the timeline is partly being taken out of our hands. So we can't take as much time as we want to think about these issues, and we have to start having proposals and suggestions pretty quickly. And if we can get consensus, then that's even stronger. And the way we get consensus is by having a common understanding of a broad, diverse group of sectors which are interested in this topic. So that's what I think is the way to get to a solution, at least, is to improve the understanding. There's a graphic, and I can't remember if I showed it during the AI webinar. I'm not sure if I can share my screen at the moment. Maybe I
Sharing should work.
Let's go on to. There we go. Yeah. So this diagram started off as a joke, and the idea was to separate the discussions. And the more I've displayed this, the more it actually seems to stand up pretty well. And so the idea is that AI is often described in 17 different components, but for a discussion, we need to simplify things so that people can keep track of what is being discussed. And so this is what we're using at the moment in a lot of discussions. And so based on this, I'd like to try to clump together the 17 different elements that are being used in other discussions into these 4 categories, or see if there is a need to add a 5th or a 6th category. And hopefully starting from that ridiculous oversimplification, we will be able to help more people get involved in this discussion.
It's interesting you mentioned that there might be a slight gap between, let's say, the commission policymakers and industry on some topics. There might be a slight knowledge gap on definitions being used or the way people are trying to frame things. So it sounds like we could have an opportunity in something like OpenChain to try to, where possible, share information that we have. If people are trying to discuss how does the supply chain define open source? How do 1,000 companies or 10,000 companies try to define that in practice? Those type of things we're well positioned to provide some insight into. So, we are a resource that can be used on that. Not to say we have perfect answers, but we do have a lot of companies from the supply chain. I noticed a question. It came in from Yari, and it's that ISO 5230, that's the ISO standard for open source license compliance, says that as a requirement for that standard, people need to maintain a process to effectively respond to external open source inquiries. They need to publicly identify a means by which a third party can make an open source compliance inquiry. This is a different tangent to what we were just discussing, but an important point. And his question is, would there be a need to have something similar with this AI spec or slash guide? And just to be clear, we're not building an AI spec right now. We're looking at building a guide. There's a whole lot of hoops before any specification is made. But a great question. Would there maybe be a need for third parties to make inquiries regarding AI compliance? Is that something that could go into guidance? And this really seems like a question for Matthew.
Yeah, we touched on this last time, and we thought it would be if the whole purpose of us is trying to build trust in the ecosystem, if we spot something, companies, I'm going to use the word should have a means of being able to reach out to relevant people within the organization to say, there is a problem here, there is a compliance query or question, and therefore having that available was something that I certainly think is beneficial and would probably actively support having that in some form of guidance, subject to what the rest of the community want. So in short, yes.
An interesting side note is that one thing that's raised by some parties is if they have a public means to send in inquiries, would they get swamped by inquiries? And just as a side note for watchers or listeners, our experience over the last 8 years is no, that's not what happens. A few people come to you with inquiries, but it's not like opening a floodgate of administration. And I have a funny story, which actually goes back almost 20 years, because this has not been a problem for 20 years now. One of the large European companies set up an open source at companyname.com email address. And in the first year, they had 3 emails. 2 of them were themselves testing it, and one was a journalist checking in if it worked. So the overhead of having a third-party contact is normally very, very low, while the utility can be relatively high, just as a side note.
Great little anecdote. I don't have anything. Oh, sorry, Kieran, you were going to say something?
Well, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I think this is a great issue to think about. And the other side is the situation with the DMCA in America, which caused companies to receive this, the feared flood of requests, and it caused requests to be treated as serious simply because nobody had time to check if the requests actually had any legal basis or factual basis. And so maybe it would be interesting to compare what caused one system to create a flood of requests that couldn't all be responded to in a reasonable way, and what caused a different system to create almost zero non-theoretical requests. So maybe that is something that it should be looked into. Why did one work and the other not?
That's actually such a great point. It's not something that we've seen a lot of discussion on. So yeah, let's put that on the to-do list. I guess that's not a to-do for the AI work group per se. It's more of a, isn't that something we should look at in general in OpenChain if we're considering the fact that we ask for contacts for security and license compliance in our domain? We've never experienced a problem with supply chain, but as Kieran said, problem was identified in a different domain, so it's understandable that people could raise a concern. Yari suggests AI tools to address the flood of requests.
The answer to everything at the moment, I feel.
Well, Matthew, I guess the floor is yours to determine where we go next with the call.
Well, I just want to talk about that. We touched on earlier about what we're planning on doing. I just want to ensure that I bring up the right page. It's the wrong one. This is the one I wanted. So as Shane touched on before, this document here is the ISO 5230. And we went through this last time and highlighted in green and in red things that we thought would have a good overlap. And Shane has also created a Scratchpad document, which kind of, I think is a working document that we're going to start trying to capture things in here, which would start to build up this list of guidance or advice on it. And I think the next study group, we will spend more time working on this document. I think we are getting very close now to starting writing things down. And this is available to anybody, I think in OpenChain, it may even go further, for discussion, and we can talk about this next time. So that was everything on my agenda to talk about. This is the kind of the next steps. So does anyone have anything they want to ask?
Yeah, I've got one thing just to add in that, if people want to follow up on the discussion that was had around the AI Act, we do have a whole webinar on the topic. So there is a webinar available, and I've just posted it into the chat for the attendees here if they wanted to check that out.
Great, thanks, Wayne. Well, if there's nothing else or no other business, then we can propose to close the meeting, and we will meet again the first Thursday of July, or is it the second Thursday of July?
Thank you, Matthew. Great meeting. Really appreciate it.
The 11th of July, we will next meet. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Matthew.
Bye-bye.